Greetings, I am the Harpy and I do book reviews. In today's video, we are going to be talking about what I think the first law is about. Now, this is an opinion video. The other videos I've been trying to do a little bit more evidence-based. The last one was a little bit more tenuous in terms of its concreteness, but this one is entirely opinion. So we're going to be going through how I analyze the first law and talk about what I ultimately think the first law is about, how Joe wrote the first law, and what message we're supposed to be getting out of this book series. Before we get started, I want to go ahead and clarify that this is not what I think Joe intended or did not intend. This is an analysis, all right? This is devoid of any authorial intent. We're going to be talking about what the characters represent and their functional use as tools for a larger narrative. By this point, we've spent enough time with the trees to talk about a forest for a forest view. So let's not beat around the bush. If we remember back to my video on foils, we covered how each of the 6 POV characters are foils to each other. It's pretty standard stuff, if I do say so myself. But now let's get into what they mean in terms of their metaphors. All of the characters in the First Law series can be summarized by a single personified characteristic. This personification of a characteristic broaches into what I'm calling the metaphor driving the narrative. So let me explain that a little bit. If, for example, we take Artie West and I tell you that she is a personification of companionship, we can see that Artie's main modus operandi is around social engagement as a character. She's always looking for someone to talk to, someone to listen to her, someone to just spend time with her, and she acts out when she doesn't get enough social stimulation. Her metaphor is companionship, and her actions are driven by this metaphor. This is what I mean when I say that the metaphor drives the narrative. If we're comfortable with that, let's get into the 6 main characters with my foil wheel again. Starting with Glokta, he is a metaphor for logical thinking or simply logic. Another way we can phrase this is that he's left brain thinking. We can think of Glokta as the part of your brain you use when you do complex math problems. It's hard, some would say painful, and you tire really quickly while you're doing it, but eventually, after doing it long enough, you acquire different tools to aid in this process of solving a math problem. This is metaphorically who Glokta is, someone who tires easily, is always in pain, and has a variety of razor-sharp tools at his disposal, his logic tools. He's also a logical character. In addition to that, constantly with logic, we have the always jeering anxiety, or Severod, and his companion depression, Frost, who are primed to betray him at the most inopportune moments. Logic is affected by anxiety and depression in ways that we can't always understand. Again, the metaphor is driving the narrative. By comparison, we can also see how Pharaoh is the opposite of Glokta as a right brain thinking, creativity style character. She's colorblind as a subversion to the metaphor because when we think of creative thinking, we think of bright colors, we think of vivid, very Lisa Frank style. But she never tires because it's easy to hyperfixate when you're being creative. It's easy to stay up late and work on projects when it's fun and creative. But oftentimes, she loses the plot of what she ultimately wants to do because with freedom, creative freedom, comes aimless endeavors. Hence the title of the chapter, What Freedom Looks Like. It's what creative freedom looks like. Next up, we have the Dogman. The Dogman represents loyalty, especially those who are undeserving of it. He knows his buddy Logan murders people. He knows that Logan kills friend and foe alike, and for some unforeseen fucking reason, he still chooses to believe in Logan and is lost without him in his circle. That's why the Dogman is a personification of loyalty. Next up, we have Giselle. Giselle is going to be a personification or a metaphor for self-awareness or self-consciousness. He goes from having very little issue with the way people view him and doing what he wants to learning how to be kind of empathetic to those in need. Additionally, he gets super fucking butthurt when he perceives a slight in his direction. This is the ego of self-awareness and the accountability to one's own actions and one's own perceptions of others viewing them. Last up, we have Logan Nine Fingers. Logan represents instinct or sixth sense. This explains his spirit talking as kind of a matter of course for like a sixth sense parallel to an ephemeral world outside of reach that only the animal mind can reach. This also is explaining the sword that he gets from the House of the Maker, that double-edged sword. Well, it's again the metaphor driving the narrative. Instinct is a double-edged sword. It in the phrasing, not literally in this one. But it's a nod to instinct being a double-edged sword. It's a weapon for you to fight against the world, but it's also something that can harm you as well, because your instinct isn't always right. In addition to that, we have that Logan is categorically an unreliable narrator. Say one thing for Logan Nine Fingers, and then he changes the phrase every time. He gets into knife fights without a knife. The man who cannot have too many knives is in a knife fight without a knife. He's talking about how he's stealthy and immediately trips. He's good with the ladies and immediately falls on his face, metaphorically. This is all about instinct being an unreliable narrator and something that you shouldn't be listening to. So now that we've gone through metaphorically what I think each of the characters represents, let's talk a little bit about a motif that I've noticed. So if we look at each of the characters, they all have a part of a human head emphasized in the book series. Glokta has his mouth emphasized. How many times are we going to get emphasis on his crooked teeth or his alternating teeth? How he can't eat. He doesn't want to eat. He doesn't have an appetite. It's all about the mouth with Glokta. Pharaoh, her eyes. She's got good eyesight. She can see far. Nobody else can see anything, but Pharaoh sees riders. Pharaoh is colorblind. All of the things to do with the eyes. Giselle's a little weird because his is going to be ears. So when he gets hit with a mace to the face, he gets bandaged up, and the only thing he can do is listen to Logan. He has to listen to Logan's advice. He has to be willing to listen. But as his narrative continues, he is listening to things that aren't being said and reading between lines that aren't there. And that's when he gets really butthurt as king when he's being ignored because he's not being listened to. But he is listening and he doesn't like what he's hearing. We're going to have that Logan Nine Fingers represents a human skull, kind of. How many times does Logan get hit in the head in the book series? It's a lot. He gets a rock dropped on his head. The Bloody Nine has him getting hit in the head like 4 or 5 times. He gets hit in the head a couple of times, knocking the sense out of his head. Like, there's a lot of this head imagery associated with Logan. West is going to be the neck. He's always sticking his neck out, especially when there's no reason to. He's sticking his neck out for people who not necessarily don't deserve it, but sticking his neck out in situations that it is unwise to do so, which is another reason why he's a metaphor for wisdom. We have that the dogman represents a nose. He smells really good. Like, not that he smells good, that he can smell like a dog can smell. He can smell well. All right? Are we are we following? So, coupling these two ideas together, we've got the formation of a human head with the six main characters. We have these six different characteristics that are kind of personified, and we have this narrative going on in the first law. Now, in literal fashion, Joe was subverting fantasy series. He was subverting tropes in fantasy series. But book series are meant to be about stuff. They're about a story within a story. So, what is that story that Joe was writing? Not what he intended to write, what he wrote. There's a distinction there. So, again, authorial intent is like use toilet paper. You can use it, but at your own detriment. We're doing what the book says, not what Joe says. So, if we think about bias, bias is a metaphor for capitalism. He's a metaphor for financial greed or financial excess. He has a bank. He is monopolizing power through the use of money. He has green eyes. All right. There's a lot of this money imagery, and I don't know if the pound is green, but I know that the US dollar is green. So to me, green is money. Well, to me, all of this is pointing to the first law being about mindless consumerism. And part of that ties into Logan being an unreliable narrator. Because Logan is an unreliable narrator that I feel like a lot of people miss as far as his narrative is concerned, you get that Joe is gaslighting everybody along with Logan to believe that he isn't the problem. He isn't the villain. When in actuality, he is the villain. He's the bad guy. He's constantly doing evil things. He's killing kids in the first couple of chapters, but they attacked him first. So we're okay with it. We're okay that he did bad things in his past. Why? Because he's trying to take accountability for it. And he's a different man now. Logan is the villain of the First Law series. And he's not an anti-hero. There's a distinction. He's like an anti-villain in a way. But getting back to this mindless consumerism thing, we have narratively that Baez utilizes the opposite of a philosopher's stone, right? The seed is just a philosopher's stone that's been reversed. To battle the consumptive masses, the masses that want to consume. And what we get with the characters via metaphor is that Joe wrote the First Law series, I think, about writing a book. I think that the narrative parallels really nicely with the different characteristics outlined that almost every human has with writing a book. The wide and barren north is a metaphor for the blank page. Creative freedom is what freedom looks like. We get that self-image or conscientiousness in Giselle is increasingly fragile the more you poke holes in it as you write your book and you are trying to make something good and it's just not coming out. We get that wisdom, the wisdom to do things that you think is right, doesn't always work, especially when writing a book. And so when we get all of this together, I think that Joe's narrative is, again, metaphor driving the narrative. It's about writing a book, and the book is about mindless consumerism. The mindless consumerist nature comes from Baez being a metaphor for capitalism by wielding a consumption stone against consumptive masses. And we get a little bit more nuance when we think of the seed as an idea, as a metaphor for an idea. So there is a phrase that popped into my head when I was reading the First Law series, and it's that the most contagious disease in the world is a thought. It's an idea. And to me, that metaphor is really strong with the seed because it's a disease causing thing. It's the disease that nobody can withstand except for creativity. Creativity doesn't need to be ruined by an idea. She doesn't need to be ruined by a thought. She doesn't have to listen to the voices. She doesn't have to listen to what people want. Creativity is for herself. Creativity is for oneself. In addition to that, what else could withstand a disease like an idea? Wisdom. Wisdom could withstand it for a little bit, not forever, but metaphorically it makes sense, at least to me. And so the seed functions as a subverted philosopher's stone, but it also functions as an idea or a thought. And that thought is the impetus for the book series in this metaphor that we're talking about. So, to summarize this in a more concise way, I believe that Joe wrote down the steps to writing a book. So, step 1, you start with a blank page. Step 2, you jot down some ideas. Step 3, you edit. All of these different portions, I think, parallel really nicely with the narrative because what we get with each of the book series is what it's like to write a book over the course of the series. We get that the wide and bare north again is a blank page. We get that money is a motivating factor for writing a book. We get that creative freedom is really difficult. And again, I'm a little bit of a hypocrite. Joe is always joking online about how he wishes somebody would tell him what to write. So to me, I think that it would make a lot of sense that Joe wrote a book about writing a book, especially a fantasy series subverting fantasy series. In addition to that, I think that the book that he was attempting to write is an idea based off of mindless consumerism. The idea of people missing the point, which a lot of people do, especially in the discussions online, some blogs that I've read. A lot of people seem to think that Logan is a great hero. Not a great hero in terms of being a good person, but a great hero narratively. I feel like I am in the minority when I think of Logan as an absolute villain. And I think that was Joe's intention. I think that by making him an unreliable narrator that is relatable, he's poking holes in people's ability to critically think about what it is that they're consuming, what it is that they're going along with. And I think that that's why the series is about mindless consumerism, is this coupling of these ideas, this coupling of this head motif that we have. There's a head in the first Law series, and we don't know who it belongs to. It could be Joe's authorial head, it could be Lord Grimdark, it could be the head of the reader inside the book, but we have all of these different kind of motifs that tie together and complement each other. So in conclusion to this video series, let's circle back to the initial question, the question of whether or not Joe is a good author or a bad author. In my opinion, Logan Ninefingers is intentionally written as an unreliable narrator. I think that that little bit with the river that I covered in the first video is going to be an Easter egg. That's the concrete evidence you need to go back and be like, oh, Logan is full of shit. He is unreliable. He isn't somebody I can trust. But in addition to that, I think that Joe is a very good author. I think he has tremendous command over the way that he writes, and more importantly, the way that he edits. I think that there are plenty of parallels to demonstrate why I think that the series is about writing a book. I think that those letters back and forth between Archlector Salt and Glokta are the editing phase. I think that the release phase is the last book, and releasing the idea upon the masses. The last little bit of evidence for this video that I'm going to leave y'all with is going to be the covers of the First Law books. So I'm going to put a picture up, and I want y'all to look at what's consistent between all three books. It's that seal. It's that weird circle with the symbols on it. Looks very alchemical, but it's not. It's religious. That is the Sigillum Dei. It is the seal of God, and it has God and all of his angels. But remember, Joe likes to subvert things. So what is the opposite of God and his angels? It's man and his demons.